Part 2, Autoethnography and Design Research. When thinking about embodied interaction, one of the best places to start is through observation. Observation of how other people use digital technologies. And through this, we can somehow gain a better understanding of their phenomenological experience, their first-person point of view of using and interacting with the things that we digitally make. A related word and a method for doing this is ethnography. However, it's a bit of a loaded term. Ethnography comes from the sciences, and at its most literal definition means the scientific description of the customs of individual peoples and cultures. It's an observational research method derived from the social sciences, which interestingly are still considered part of the humanities and not the hard sciences. An observational research method just means that we watch and observe in order to gather data that then can be later analyzed and hopefully interpreted. In a design context, ethnography is most interesting for the way that it can find correlations between disparate social and cultural practices and make meaning out of those findings. In the most optimistic and sort of ideal version, ethnography in a design context can generate empathy by finding the places where different societies and cultures overlap, bringing them together through the language of design. However, it's important to acknowledge that ethnography has a bit of a troubled history. Again, originating from the hard sciences, which were largely coming from a Western empirical and colonial perspective, ethnography was often practiced by anthropologists who, coming from the white Western world, planted themselves into native indigenous populations and conducted their research as participants within those communities. This occurred mostly during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and many social scientists and anthropologists quote-unquote embedded themselves, but also wrote quite objectively about their subjects as if there was some kind of false distance that was created simply by putting pen to paper, even though they were living their day-to-day lives in and amongst these peoples, obviously being influenced the entire time by interacting very sort of closely and intimately with these populations. In the photo that you see on the left-hand side, this is the famous anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski in the Trobriand Islands in the South Pacific. And even though we don't see him necessarily taking notes or photographing these subjects in the picture, you can bet that he made a kind of false division between, let's say, sitting here and in this picture, they're actually stirring up ink in small ceramic pots and taking part in this activity, but he was also writing about them as if distanced through, let's say, the lens of a microscope in his actual journals and diaries. So there's a bit of a problematic false kind of divide that's been put in place there. The other problem with ethnography, at least without acknowledging the kind of arbitrary divide, of course, is that it becomes increasingly difficult for the researcher to then separate their personal from their professional interests. In this doctored cartoon that you see on the left, the sentiment, "Can you hurry this up?" meaning, can you do your quote-unquote native thing so I can report on it, strains the relationship that is, supposed to be nurtured and made in this process of living in and amongst a community. So for this very reason, many indigenous populations have unfortunately been exploited and mistreated, even sort of despite the best interests of the ethnographer, because they end up being data points or descriptions rather than pictured and honored as real living people and cultures. However, that doesn't mean that ethnography needs to be thrown out entirely. It still has use especially in design. In fact, it's crucial to many aspects of design practice because it's essential that ethics and empathy enter the picture whenever the specter of the user is raised in a design conversation. Ethnography can be a tool, a very helpful one for design research, as long as we treat it carefully and we think about it as being user-focused and iterative. Because design doesn't take place in a vacuum, it needs the user to activate the forms that we make as functional objects, or let's say interfaces, in the digital context. So research into the needs of the various users, i.e. the people, communities, and cultures that will be interacting with your design work, can be considered a kind of ethnography. If we look at an illustration of the design thinking model, here represented by the 5 stages: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, and also noting that it's a recursive process that feeds back into itself, we can notice that, first of all, to empathize and identify with the needs of the user takes ethnography, because one must observe and study whoever or whomever those users are in the first place in order to get an understanding of what the audience is for your design. At the end of that process, we also have the testing, which involves taking it and giving it to the prospective users to find out whether or not it works for them, how well or how poorly it meets their expectations. So at both points, at the end and the beginning of this iterative design thinking model, we have ethnographic research kind of as the underpinning of those 2 stages. If we take this idea a little bit further, we don't, as much as we need the user and we need to consider users other than ourselves, we can also start much more simply by looking critically back at ourselves, our own habits and behaviors as a user, including our own expectations of a designed product. So here we introduce the concept of autoethnography, or ethnography of the self. In the simplest one-statement or one-sentence definition, autoethnography is the act of critically observing oneself. This includes documenting one's behaviors in order to gain insight into the conditions and contributing factors. Again, thinking about embodiment, this can be physical, social, and cultural all at the same time, that lead to those behaviors. This is also considered a self-reflexive research method because we constantly reference ourselves or point back at ourselves, so the subject and the object are actually the same in this method of research. The exact process of autoethnography is unique to each person and each design problem/challenge, but it always involves documentation of some kind of one's experience. And this can take many different forms, be it photography, video, note-taking, or more formalized as exercises of reflective writing. Most importantly, autoethnography can reveal important patterns of use and personal preferences, while at the same time revealing our personal biases and the limitations of the design at hand. So autoethnography can be thought of as a complementary model to getting to know other users, while you also analyze your own self as a user and your expectations of the thing that you are actively making. I want to look at a quick example here of some autoethnography. This is a data visualization of artist and researcher Dana Marie Louise's email network. She used the immersion data visualization tool provided by MIT to better understand how her own expectations of her social lived reality either correlated or maybe didn't to how her email communication plays out in a visually networked form. So if we look at some of these data points, we can see that central to it, well, first of all, 2 things. The size of the nodes here means the frequency of communication, so how many emails have been sent. And then each line that you see is an individual message. The closer that the nodes are to each other means more communication has happened more frequently between them. So we can see different groupings, different sort of facets of her life. There's the cross-country and track team, the economics department at the college that she works at. But interestingly enough, Louise's mom is the largest node in the network, and yet probably the most disconnected in terms of direct email communication to anyone else, including Louise's boyfriend, who she met in college and still remains closely tied to the network of other economics department students, colleagues, and peers. She's also pointed out here on the far right that there is an outlier, someone with whom I networked for a job I didn't get. But the node is large enough because there were probably enough communications about that particular job that it's still within the visualization tool means that that person, or those messages rather, were formative to her social reality. So part of this work is to understand what your assumptions are, and for Dana Marie Louise, what her assumptions were about how well her email life and the messages that she was sending back and forth day to day actually reflected her sense of lived social reality. The geography, the felt sensations, the affect, the emotions that she was attaching to the people in her life and who she was interacting with. But at certain points, it also clearly states that some things were not maybe as she had expected. For instance, her professor in the sociology department with whom I did research, reading from the text here, is only connected to one other person, one other data point in the whole network, yet this person remains rather large in terms of an individual node. So someone can be rather important in your email communication life, but not necessarily as important in terms of your felt, sensed social reality. We can also think about this in a sort of art and design context through a useful analogy of framing. Once we create something, like a gallery, like a photograph or a painting or a print in a museum, we put it up on the wall in succession with many other pieces that we've made. The frame itself kind of binds it to a specific time and place. And even though the image can give us an idea of what our intention was and tells a story and has lots of visual information within it, it doesn't necessarily stay connected and live within a network of evolving connections. It's more or less, it's been edified, meaning that it is kind of divorced from that network and now lives in its own independent reality, which is bounded and limited by the borders of the frame. Going a step further, we can also think about the frame and the piece within it as a material artifact, meaning that the frame itself actually has its own history and its own materials that are important to that whole idea of how it means something in relation to all of the other objects in the gallery. The image that you're looking at right now, I think, is useful. It's called a mise en abîme in French, meaning a place in the abyss, because we can think about each act of framing as also framing itself. And what I mean by that is that the way that something has been hung in a gallery, the way that it's displayed and positioned, actually reveals something about the intentions and what the people who made it and framed it and hung it, something about the way that they were thinking about that information is revealed through the visual representation and its eventual display. So the frame itself, as an act, as an object, and as a symbol, is just as important as what it contains. Someone who's done a lot of thinking about this, that is, the translation of an idea into a stable physical artifact, something that's been framed, is the social scientist Lucy Suchman. And beginning in the 1980s, working in the area of science and technology studies, she came up with a theory called situated action. Her most famous study was in 1987 at the Xerox company, where she observed users of an electronic help system on a photocopier. Starting from a framework that describes all action as being a product of the context in which it is taken, Suchman observed users attempting to complete photocopies with the help of an expert computer system designed to help them through the different stages and identify and troubleshoot any of the problems. However, through her analysis of video recordings of people using the photocopier, as well as having a manual of the design framework used to establish the interface, Suchman developed a very rich and detailed understanding of the many differences that occurred between the human model of understanding the copier and the design model that led to, in her words, communication breakdowns and task failures. Basically, in her view, the way that things were designed had almost nothing to do with the eventual realities of using the machine. So Suchman concluded that the design model lacked empathy, and it didn't consider the lived experience of the human users who would eventually put it into practice. She said that those who do not think in the same way as designers or machines do not matter, because in her view, the users were left behind. Moreover, when ideas are physical, they can be left and returned to with context preserved. So they become, like the framed things in a gallery, studyable. When data and ideas are physical, they are the living representation of the emergent shared understanding of that thing. But until then, when ideas are purely digital, when things are purely data on a screen, they lack the same immediacy and, in Suchman's words, situatedness that will ultimately tell whether they resonated with their users and did what they were supposed to. This is important because Suchman concluded that not enough design happens with users, not just with the users in mind, but with the actual populations. And this relates back to the idea of ethnography. If one is not actively living in and amongst the populations that one is designing for, how can one be certain that one's designs actually work, especially when they are very tailored to a particular kind of task? Extrapolating from this, it's also important to think about the idea that when we create things, we are people too. Like the first part of the lecture, our embodiment matters as well. So how do we take account of our own situatedness and how this becomes then frozen in time through the objects and even, in a sense, the digital interfaces and interactions that we design once they go out into the world? At that point, they're no longer our own and part of our individual consciousness, but a shared thing, which Suchman would say then actually takes on more meaning because it can be discussed apart from identity and more in the social reality. All right, so what does this all mean? Thinking about the idea of embodied interactions through a method of observing oneself, interacting with digital technologies, i.e. autoethnography, and eventually thinking about situated action, the things that can only be sensed once a designed product leaves our fingertips and moves into the public realm. What does this all mean for today's interaction designers? One, that we need to be thinking of every interaction as physical and digital, that we need to have a holistic perspective of our bodies as part of the digital spaces that we navigate. Until we begin to do that, very little of this will matter. Two, we should be treating interactive experiences as products of particular times, spaces, bodies, and identities. Although we love to think about the modernist ideal of designing for everyone, all the time, everywhere, sometimes this just isn't possible. And thinking more specifically about one community of users or another will actually create a better design experience in the end. Thirdly, understanding interaction as an evolving network of factors and forces. If you go back to part 1 of the lecture and the visual experiment of the person using the smartphone in public, we can think about the idea that using a smartphone is completely different depending on the time of day, where we are, how hungry we are, what the weather is doing, and that this is an evolving set of circumstances. So designing interactions means that we can't anticipate everything, but that we should try and anticipate the many different contexts in which the interaction takes place. Fourthly, taking and making the time to critically observe, document, and reflect on user experience. And this means ourselves, too. Being autoethnographic about the things that we make in digital spaces will help us to better understand what other people expect from the same technologies. 5, translating these observations, i.e. data, into a form and process for others to use and experience. This sounds very simple, but as you've probably put together from this lecture, it can actually be kind of a complex thinking process. So how do we take what we observe about our own experiences and translate them then into a way that is actually useful and helpful to others? And that's a rhetorical question that I can't answer for you in this lecture, but hopefully just instill in you the importance of thinking about this question and keeping it in mind as you work. And then finally, analyzing through what we've made the less obvious gaps that might emerge between the different user experiences. These gaps are the things that reveal the situated actions, the things that we did as part of a design community that can't necessarily be seen or sensed until we put them out into the world. But we can still learn really important lessons from coming back to them and discussing them with others about either what met their expectations and their needs and what didn't, or how maybe perhaps something was intended to do something very specific and actually led to its use as a completely other sort of tool or asset. And that can be equally as valuable. So I hope throughout all of this that I've given you a lot to chew on and to think about, that in terms of designing digital interactions, there's actually a kind of philosophical dimension that can be, yes, a bit difficult to engage and to tackle, but actually gives a lot of meaning, a lot of existential meaning to what it is that we do as designers, especially when we think about creating a more bridged and shared space between the physical and the digital. This concludes the second part of the lecture. I hope that it was useful to you. And if you have any questions or comments on this, you can send me an email at zperl, P-E-A-R-L, @ocadu.ca. Thanks so much for your time. C'est le but, c'est fini. Merci tout le monde. The end.